Hello, third graders. I am so glad to be with you today. So, I was looking through some joke books and I found one that I should have told several months ago when we talked about the Cretan Bull. Remember the Cretan Bull that then had Minotaur and the maze and all that sort of things? Okay, so here's the joke. What do you call a bull that's sleeping? You call it a bulldozer? Well, speaking of Hercules, we're going to kind of step aside from Hercules today and talk about, since it's Earth Month, we can talk about some of my favorite animals, and that is the eagle. And I wanted to tell you this story just called The Eagle is one of my favorites, partly because it's beautiful and it's about Colorado, where I lived for a very long time, and also because it was written by one of my good storytelling friends. So I hope you like The Eagle. The boy moved with his family to Colorado mountains, and they had a lovely log house deep in the woods, and they could hike so many different trails, and there was a lake nearby, and his father taught him from a very young age how to fish. Not the kind of fishing that we do a lot of around here. This is fly fishing. You've seen that kind of thing? And you take the fishing pole and you do it back and forth and back and forth, and you're casting out the line that has like a bug on it, but it's not a real bug, it's called a fly. But it looks like the flies and the bugs that are hatching right now. So he loved doing that, and he became quite good. And as he got to be in about fourth or fifth grade, he was able to go by himself to the nearby lake, and he became quite good at it. The lake was beautiful. It was kind of bean shaped, and it was surrounded by mountains, and usually the mountains still had some snow on the top of it, even like in July. And it was very clear from the edges. You could see quite a distance down, and sometimes you could see the fish. His favorite spot was at a little inlet where there was a big flat rock, and nearby was a big pine tree that had been struck by lightning, and the top of it had died. In fact, there were just some branches there. Well, an eagle had its roosting place there, and so that's why the boy really liked it. Now, this was not just any eagle. This eagle was born to a mother on the other side of this mountain range. But it was the first egg to hatch. It was the first of that group of chicks that learned to fly. And it was the first of them that learned to fish from rivers and fish from lakes. It knew how to fly into the sun so the fish couldn't see the shadow, and how to look for fish. And then when it was time, you just flap the wings once and then dive down and pick it up. She learned that you couldn't get a fish too big, because it was too big, you couldn't grip the side of the fish. It would fall out. You couldn't get a fish too small, because then it was too small to carry and it would slide out. So it learned to get just the right size fish. Well, when the boy started fishing at that favorite spot, he knew that he wanted to make friends with that eagle. Now, you don't make friends very easily with the eagle, but he just, every time when he would come, he would take his baseball hat and kind of tip it like, "Hello, I see you, and I will be respectful of you." And he loved watching that eagle fish. And interestingly, the eagle liked watching him, and he guessed it was fishing. and the boy would throw that long line that the eagle must have thought of as a magic stick, and how he would land it out there in the water, and then with the reel pull it in. And oftentimes the boy caught 2 or 3 fish, and he was very good at what he did. And they seemed to have this good, respectful relationship. Sometimes the eagle wasn't able to find anything. All people who fish sometimes have those days where they just can't catch anything. And the boy happened to notice that one day, that all afternoon the eagle hadn't caught anything. So before he left that day, he took the biggest trout out of his package, out of his little creel basket, and laid it on the rock, tipped his hat to the eagle, and walked away into the forest. But when he got under the cover of trees, he stopped and watched. The eagle waited for a while and kept looking around, surveying, being sure that there was no one around. And then it swooped out over the lake and came back in and landed on the far side of that rock. It eventually walked up closer and closer and closer to that fish. It seemed to nudge it a little bit to see if it was still alive. And finally, it sat on it, sunk its talons into that fish, and took it up into its perch and ate it up there in that perch. Well, the boy was delighted. He couldn't wait to run all the way home and tell his mom and dad that he had, in effect, fed an eagle. He did that several more times when the eagle didn't catch anything. Summer was over, and then came the cool autumn days. And you can imagine in the Colorado mountains, it got cool quickly. By October, it was very cold. And oftentimes the fish would go deeper into the water because the water was so cold, and it would kind of dive down deeper. So the boy had come out that autumn afternoon to fish. He didn't have much daylight left, and he cast his rod over and over, cast his line over and over, but he never caught anything. Nothing. And he was packing up to leave when the eagle let out this huge cry. Rah! And he looked up, and just then the eagle took flight, and it flew up toward one of the mountains and then came back around, so it was flying into the setting sun. And it flew down so fast that the boy thought, there's no way he can pull out and make a dive. And just at the right time, it leveled off so that it was within a few feet of the water. And at the right moment, it dove down and grabbed a beautiful trout. And the boy watched in awe as he lifted that trout into the air, and water dripped off of it like little tiny rainbows as the sun shone through. Then the eagle circled back around and landed on the boy's rock. And it left the fish there. The eagle seemed to know that the boy was just at the edge of the forest, and it flapped its wings a couple of times, took off, and went back up to its perch on the high top of that burnt pine tree. The boy realized that the eagle was giving him a fish. So he went down and carefully picked up the fish, and he looked again up at the eagle to be sure he wasn't offending him, and he put it in his creel, his basket, And then he nodded his hat to the eagle to say thanks. Thanks for something that his mother would be surprised at. He turned and tried to walk calmly home, but he was so excited it was kind of hard to do that. But he could just imagine not only would his mother be so happy on this late autumn day to cook fresh fish, but she would wonder what made those holes on each side of it. And he couldn't wait to tell her about his friend the eagle who had caught him a fish. And that is the story of the eagle. Isn't that a great story? Like I said, I love that one. Right now, we are going to do a draw and tell. You know, I've done some cut and tells with you before. Well, I think it's time for us to do a draw and tell. I'm sorry, I'm going to reach and grab a pen here. This story is about Avery and Campbell, and they belong to a junior hiking club. And in order to kind of earn points in the club, you had to go out and do a nice hike and then camp overnight. So the two women got together that weekend and said, okay, we are going on a hike. And first they started on a long, cleared space, and it was far too clear for them to hike. They didn't want to be out in the open. So they kept walking. And finally they came to a forest, and they walked all through the forest. On and on they went. And when they got to a break in the forest, they went down another path. Sorry, we'll hold this up a bit so you can see it. But there wasn't anything there that was good, looked like a good camping site. So they came back up the trail and walked again. Up hills and down hills, up hills and down hills, until they came to almost a cliff. And so they walked down, but they didn't find anything down there, so they walked back up. As they started walking in a line, Campbell said, oh look, I think I see a lake. It would be nice to hike around a lake and maybe even cast our tent there. So they decided to walk around the lake, and they kept walking. It was a rather large lake. And they decided that hiking back over here near the lake would be good. So they got off the trail and they went and pitched their tents. And when they were in there making the campfire right outside their campsite, they realized that the bird that was flying around was an eagle. There, we'll get the lighting right. And so now you've heard my story of the draw and tell about the eagle. I'm going to tell you another story that is called the eagle. And I used to teach junior high and high school, and it was one of my favorite stories to teach. I'm sorry, it was called the Erne from the Coast. E-R-N-E. The Erne from the Coast takes place in Ireland on a farm owned by the Thorburns. The Thorburns had a huge farm. Toby's father had bought a small patch of land, and through the years he had added and added. So down low in the farm there was excellent farmland. But then you could walk along some mountains, and it was some great high meadows. And on the other side of those cliffs was the ocean, and it was beautiful to look at. Well, Mr. Thorburn was a very hard worker, and he was kind of hard on his family, too. He'd sort of yell a lot. But, most of the time people just tried to remember that he was tired and that was just his way. Up on the mountains, on the Thorburn farm, they had kept some sheep, and Michael was the sheep herder up there. One day, when Mr. Thorburn was down by the barn, the mailman came up in his little truck, and he said, "Mr. Thorburn, I have a letter here for Michael. I think it is very important that he gets it. I'm afraid it might be telling about his brother that is very ill. He may have to leave immediately." Mr. Thorburn took the letter and said, "Thank you." And he turned to Toby and said, "Do you think you can get your lazy bones up that hill? And I do mean fast." Toby said, "Yes, Father, yes." And he turned and he started running, and he almost had tears in his eyes because his father was always calling him lazy and that he didn't uphold everything, and he worked really hard to please his father, and he was just a plain old hard worker, good kid. But by the time he got up to the top, he found Michael, and he loved being with Michael. Michael was an older man and said, "How be you tonight?" He says, Mr. Michael, I'm afraid we have a letter for you." And as he petted Tassie the dog, Michael read the letter, and he said, "Ah, yes, it is about my brother in town. He's very ill. They're afraid he may not make it. I have to leave immediately. Toby, do you think you could watch over the sheep? Tabby, our big collie, is here to help you out. And they should be just fine. We've had a lot of lambs, but everybody should be just fine." Toby sort of stood prouder and said, "Well, sure, I can do that." And so Michael left, and Toby walked around. He threw sticks for Tassie, the dog. He petted some of the sheep, and he held some of the babies. But then, after a couple of hours, after it was getting toward dark, the sheep all began to kind of gather together in a circle, and they made all of the lambs get on the center, and they gathered around them, and they were all kind of stirring, and Tassie kept running around the herd trying to be sure everybody was okay, when they could hear this loud "Ah!" in the sky, and coming up and over the cliff was this huge bird. Yeah, it kind of had the head like an eagle, that sharp beak and those talons, but its wingspan was bigger than a man's arms, and it had a yellow face and a yellow body and gray on its back, and it was coming straight at the sheep, and it would ah, and all the sheep were really nervous, and they kept gathering around the lambs, and Tassie was barking and jumping and barking and jumping, trying to keep this huge bird off of those sheep, the lambs. And just then the bird went high and then came down, and with its talons bared, it grabbed one of the baby lambs and picked it up and started carrying it off toward the sea. Toby ran after it, throwing rocks at it, saying, "Stop, stop." Tassie was on its heels, biting and biting and biting. When they got to the very edge where a boulder was, the huge bird stopped and stood at them. And as it came toward him, it dove toward the dog and dove toward the boy. And they both backed off because they were so afraid. And then the bird swooped up, grabbed the lamb, and carried it out to sea. Oh, Toby thought, Father has to know about this. I'll go down right now and tell him. Tabby, you watch the sheep. Tassie, you watch the sheep. You keep circling them. I'll go down and I'll be back in the early morning. So he ran down so fast. It was several miles, but he ran down without falling down that rocky slope. And he found his father talking to some men, and they were all smoking their pipe. And he said, Father, and Mr. Thorburn turned to him and he says, "What are you bothering me about, you silly boy? You're supposed to be up there. You are nothing but a scaredy cat." And he kind of pushed his son a little bit. He said, "Father, there was a huge bird and it carried off one of the lambs and almost attacked Tassie and tried to get me. Don't you tell me any lies." And he looked at the other men. He said, "Can you believe this? My son lies to me. Get going. Get back up there." So the boy walked back, and as soon as he turned, tears started coming down his face. Not only did his father yell at him and not believe him, but embarrassed him in front of these other men who he respected. But by the time he got back up to the top, he had found a huge branch of a tree, really big, and he knew what he was going to do. By the time he got up there, it was almost dark, and he sat by the fire, built up the fire huge, hoping for sure nothing would attack the sheep again. And all night long, he sat there with his knife, scraping the end of that post so that it came to a sharp point. Even when he touched it, it almost cut his hand. He tried to sleep, but he could not sleep. He was kind of, in some ways, hoping the big bird would come back. In other ways, he was hoping it wouldn't, because he worried about the sheep, and he worried about Tassie, and he worried about himself. Finally, it was morning. He and Tassie were out early, and the sheep were already nervous after what had happened yesterday, but they kept a watch. About an hour after sunrise, up over that rocky cliff comes that huge bird. Again, that wingspan is bigger than a man's. It has a yellow head, and it starts just squawking and squawking and flying. It was so big, it cast shadows on the ground as it ran. Tassie was going berserk. Toby got out and started running and hitting and trying to get it away, trying to be sure it didn't pick up another lamb. But sure enough, it did. It picked up another lamb and started climbing. Tassie jumped at it and grabbed some of the tail feathers of the bird. Meanwhile, Toby was hitting at it and knocked off some feathers too. That bird set the lamb down and turned around, and with a huge dive, it came straight at Tassie. Tassie knew what was going to happen, so she laid herself out flat, hoping that it wouldn't get her. But that bird landed right on Tassie's side and ripped its side and killed the dog. Oh, Toby was so sad. That was a wonderful dog, a great sheep herding dog. Now it was mad because the bird had not only killed a favorite dog, but was about to carry off another lamb. With that, Toby just started springing up and swatting at the bird. And the bird went up into the air and came down and clawed one of Toby's eyebrows off. But with the blood flowing, he just wiped it out of his eyes. And he kept swinging and swinging. And finally he could hit its feet. And finally he hit its arm. And finally, with one blow on its neck, he killed that bird. He was so exhausted, but he had killed the bird. But the dog was dead. So he carefully gathered the sheep, made sure they'd be safe, and then he carried the dog because it was such a prized dog, and he slowly went back down the hill. And he realized as he was walking that one of his arms didn't feel like it fit into his shoulder socket anymore, but he still carried it. And when he got down to the barnyard, his father was walking out of the barn, and he was about to start yelling at him again and said, "Toby, what?" And he saw the blood just pouring out of his son's eyebrow. And then he saw that his arm was kind of hanging crooked, and the dead dog. Toby looked up at his father and said, "It came back. but I killed it. Mr. Tobias picked up Toby and carried him in the house. Toby's mother came running to them in the house and said, "Let me take him." And she put him in the bed, and she began to clear his eyebrow to see how deep the cut was. Toby's father said to one of the hired hands, "Go to town, get the doctor, quickly, 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 drive the car." So they came, and pretty soon the doctor came in the door and said, "I hear there's a boy injured here. Hear it fought some kind of a big bird. Hear that it killed that wonderful dog Tassie." He came and looked at Toby's eyelid and said, "Oh my goodness, this was done by a bird, son? This is terrible." And he stitched it up and gave him a shot so he could sleep better. All night long, Mr. Tobias sat by his son, never said a word, just sat by his son. Word had gotten to Michael down in the village about what had happened. He had come straight up out of the village and had gone up to check on the sheep. And about mid-morning of the next day, he came down with this huge bird. The bird was 6 feet long and probably had a 12-foot wingspan. Michael came into the house and said, "Mr. Tobias, that was an ern from the coast. It's an eagle, a sea eagle. And all my years of being a shepherd, I've only seen one other, and it was not nearly that big. And your son took care of that bird." Well, Toby healed over the course of several weeks, and one night his father took him to an Irish pub and said, "Men, I want you to meet my hero, the sun. I was mean to him and didn't give him credit, but he's here to tell you about the ern from the coast." And everybody applauded Toby, and said, "What a man." And his father was respectful to him for the rest of his life. You have heard my stories, and you've listened very well. Now they are yours to tell. You've heard 3 stories about eagles. Thank you so much. Bye.